So Barbara, Blueprint for Better Business, what is it? Why do we need it?
Right. The absolute essence of it is that business can and should have a social purpose. That's not about CSR or anything. It's not about doing good. It is actually that the purpose, the core purpose of the business, has something that will contribute to society. And the reason that's so important right now is that we all know that trust in business has gone, very far down, and that actually the public, society, will only trust business, will only give it the legitimacy to operate if it feels that it is actually producing things, doing things that are of good in society. It's also incredibly important for employees, because we know that people want to go to work and feel it has meaning, that they can make a difference in what they do. So to have that central purpose there is absolutely key to a good business.
And what do you think the gap is between that ideal and actually where we are?
Oh, well, it partly depends on where you are. In some areas, we are a long way from that. You think about the whole issues that have been raised recently about taxation and companies actually paying what they should in different countries. But of course, it's very different when you're in countries like America and Europe, where there are a lot of good regulations, companies have behaved better. But what we're talking about is places that I've traditionally worked in Africa and so on, where there are no regulations. But under this, you would still expect those companies to be true to their core business, to their core purpose, even if there are no regulations about. So it is people operating commonly across the world to the purpose of their business.
Okay, thank you. Archbishop, what has faith, the teachings of faith, got to offer us in terms of this debate? What's the relevance?
Well, I think from my point of view, the tradition of reflection in the Catholic Church on these issues has gone on for 100 years. Some of it actually started in London, in this city, with Cardinal Manning. And what he was concerned about was exactly this, the connection between a person's life that they treasure with their family and the values they try to share and inculcate in their children, and what they do at work, and whether that's respected and whether there's a synergism between these two. So I think faith helps us to understand our humanity, and if we can bring the best of our humanity to our corporate efforts, then those efforts are more successful and more satisfying.
Why do you think business has strayed from this path, this ideal path of purpose? What's gone wrong?
Well, I think we've heard some interesting points today that show that investors and business leaders are actually quite expert in what I would call the sinfulness of humanity. So we're tempted. There are temptations around all the time to deflect us from what we know is for the best. And I think this process can help us to sit down, talk together, and say, what do we really want to achieve for the good of society, for my good, for my family's good, and in that sense begin to distinguish again between greed and well-doing.
Okay, thank you. So Paul, taking that on, how would that translate into a global company like Unilever?
Well, the world situation that we operate in currently is very challenging. Lots of pressures for businesses as well, and business people or CEOs like ourselves are subject to that any day. And what we really strive to do is running these companies that have been around for 100 years or more, and we certainly want to be around for many more. We want to have a business model that is more sustainable, that is longer term, and where we can make the decisions, obviously, as well, that serve the benefit of keeping the institution alive for the long term. The best way to do that is to really ask yourself, why are you here? You're here, first and foremost, to serve society. And the Blueprint for Better Business puts that right in the middle. Be careful what you do towards the citizens you serve, towards the suppliers or providers you deal with, towards your employees, towards the next generations longer term. And if you take all these multiple stakeholders into account, you get a business model that's also more in sync with society. If you are myopically focused on one of these stakeholders and sub-optimize the others, you ultimately will be rejected. And the beauty of this blueprint is, once more, is it takes this holistic view of how do you, it's a challenge, but how do you move your business model forward by serving everybody? What we find is, looking at a longer term, more sustainable model, like in the case of Unilever, that it actually takes risks out of the equation. For example, you think about climate change, you think about geopolitical disruptions, and you build things into your model to mitigate it. You take cost out of the system. We're hitting planetary boundaries, we're using more resources than we can replenish. By thinking about it, the sustainable aspect of it, you take costs out of the system. We look at our products and say, how can these products even better serve our people and better serve the citizens of this world? How can they address the problems that are out there, the problems of food security or sanitation or employment, if you want to. And as you see that these problems are actually fairly huge still in this world, you also see that the opportunities to address them are enormous for businesses. So it actually grows your business in that sense. And then last but not least, not surprisingly to you, but it is incredibly motivating for the people that are directly connected to this business model, either on our own payroll, our own employees, or all the suppliers or partners that we work with, to do something that has a little bit of a longer term, deeper meaning than just making money. And as I've always said, it's important that business makes profit, but that's not the purpose of business. And this blueprint, again, helps us have the conversations to drive ourselves to higher levels in that respect.
And if we take, let's say, one sector, which is the finance sector, there's still a lot of anger out in the world about the sense that the finance sector lost its sense of purpose. What if you were to, let's say, apply blueprint to the finance sector, what sort of difference might we see?
Well, the first thing I always say is that if you look at the trust in institutions, it's relatively low at all levels, be it government, be it the financial sector, be it business, be it CEOs itself. We really have a trust problem in general. And I think what the blueprint is doing is it brings us all back together and say, hey, why are we here in the first place? And how can we work together to give that a deeper meaning? We have created with the banking sector, for example, the Banking Environment Initiative, so that the banking sector works with the consumer goods industry to look at lending practices and only do it to sustainable sourced products instead of unsustainably sourced products. So we can give the banking sector a meaning. We need transformative financing for the poor people in society, and these microfinancing initiatives, many of the banking sectors are now getting more involved in it again. So the banking sector, which probably has been one step removed from society for different reasons, which we all have created ourselves, we need to also be part, as in partnership, to bring them back to what it originally was meant to be, which was a means to an end, not an end in itself. I'm very confident that we can get there again, but it needs leadership from the top in the financial world, but it also needs embracing from the rest of society. So the critical part there I would leave behind. The partnership part I would stress, and it's very good to see that even again on the Blueprint for Better Business, we're getting enormous traction also from the financial sector to be part of that, and we can all educate and help each other to then drive it to a higher level.
Okay, thank you. And Rebecca, you do teach at Harvard around reimagining capitalism. Is this idea of sort of coming back to purpose, to service, to being part of society rather than thinking you're separate from, is that absolutely core to reimagining it? Is it just sitting on the side? How does it fit into this idea that actually the system needs to change? Where does this fit into that?
I think thinking about purpose is absolutely central to reimagining capitalism, to build a system that's delivered enormous benefit, but to make it so much stronger, because it's failed in so many ways. I think there are three elements of this. The first is we have increasing research that firms that are driven by purpose are more productive, more engaged, more creative, more fast-seeing, so that it strengthens individual firms, and that's tremendous. The second piece is that although it does strengthen individual firms, there are constant temptations to fall back to old ways of behaving. And so an initiative like the Blueprint for Better Business, if it can draw in other businesses so that this becomes the accepted way of behaving, if it's widely understood that this is how firms should be run, then firms are, as it were, holding each other to account. We know from all kinds of work that if everyone around me is behaving a particular way, it becomes much easier to behave that way myself. So I think this focus on purpose is part of changing the general gestalt about why I work, what I focus on, why I'm excited to run a firm. And the third part, which I think is also important, is I think we need to build a capitalism where purpose-driven firms are the easiest and best way to run any organization. And that means that eventually we will need institutional changes to support firms behaving in these kinds of ways. So appropriate environmental legislation, so that yes, individual firms can hold back from carbon emissions, but wouldn't it be easier to have market-friendly legislation supporting that? Yes, individual firms can raise the minimum wage they pay people. Shouldn't we have comprehensive labor reform that is innovation and productivity friendly, but support firms in working with their labor forces in appropriate ways? And lastly, and this gets really tricky, how should we think about business's involvement in government? And to the degree that some business people have been very engaged with the institutional process to create a capitalism that is not fair, that is not just, that is not sustainable, maybe we should be talking about the goal of business is the well-being of the whole of society and not just the firm. And that means engaging with government in a productive, open, transparent way for the whole good of the society.
And just finally, that's the positive vision for the future. If, let's say, business just were to continue as usual, that actually it didn't take this on board, and it just ploughed on the current furrow, what is the risk if nothing changes?
There's a wonderful book by Margaret Atwood called Oryx and Crake, which depicts the world we're headed towards if we don't change. I think we see an increasingly fragmented world where the rich barricade themselves in enclaves, extracting from the rest of the population and the environment the resources they need to keep themselves going. I think it will be increasingly unjust, increasingly violent, and increasingly no fun to be a business person in. Because what's the goal? I mean, every great business person I've met doesn't really care about wealth. They want to run a great institution that makes a difference to the people around them. And that's going to get harder and harder to do in a fractious world, in an environmentally stressed world, in a world where a third of the population is having trouble eating and getting by. So I think that's not a world any of us want. I don't think it's in the interests of business either.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.